Hello and welcome to this video tutorial from blendercookie.com. My name is Bartek Skorupa and today I am going to play a little bit with render passes that we can get from cycles. Here's the animation that we will be working on. It's a typical pack shot of TV commercial. Here we are presenting the product that doesn't exist. I have made it up especially for this tutorial. When we are working on such animations, it is good to set up everything such that we can be very flexible after rendering. Because it's a very common scenario where the client comes to us just an hour or 2 hours before the deadline and says that, well, something has changed in the artwork of this box, so we need to replace it. For us, it means that we have to change the texture. So does it mean that we have to re-render everything once again? Not necessarily. In some cases, we cannot avoid this, but in this case, we can very easily take advantage of the technique of creating the final image as the combination, as the mixture of the render passes of the individual components. This way we can change, we can alter one component and all of the other are simply ready and it should mix together nicely without having to re-render. So to use this technique, we have to enable the passes and know the way of combining them. So let's go to the Properties panel, Render Buttons, and here at the bottom, when we are in Cycles Render Engine, we have the section called Layers, and down here we have the render passes. The ones that we will mostly be interested in are those ones. As you can see, the way of activating the lighting passes in Cycles is a little bit different than in Internal Render Engine, and we will need to activate all of those 9 render passes. They are grouped into 3 sections: the diffuse, glossy and transmission. Those ones are responsible for the colors, glossy for the reflections and transmission for transparency. In all of those 3 groups we have 3 render passes: direct, indirect and color. Direct is the light that directly hits the surface. So the light rays go straight from the light source, from the lamp or emitting mesh, and in this render pass we will have the influence of those light rays. Indirect is the light that hits our surface indirectly, which means that the rays hit other surfaces, it's changed a bit by this surface, it's bounced and hits our object. And then the color, so this describes the color that those light sources affect. And we have those 3 render passes for each of those 3 groups. So we have activated them. This way we have the access to them here in the compositing. Diffuse direct, diffuse indirect, diffuse color, and so on. And now we need the way of combining them together to recreate our final render. This is in fact very well documented in the manual. So let's go to blender.org, Education and Help, Wiki User Manual. And here we have the section Rendering with Cycles. When we hit Introduction, down here we can find the render passes. All of the passes are described here, but when we scroll down, we have the graph that very well describes how to combine all of those passes. So as you can see, we have those 3 groups: diffuse, glossy and transmission, and all of them are combined exactly the same way. So we take the direct and add the indirect light to it, and then we multiply the sum by the color. We do the same for glossy and transmission, and then we add combined diffuse to the combined glossy to the combined transmission, and to complete this we add emission and environment. So the first thing that I will do right now will be to recreate this graph using the nodes. Okay, so here we are back in Blender, in compositing nodes, and we have our input render layer. And here are all of our render passes: diffuse passes, glossy passes and transmission passes. So we take diffuse direct plus diffuse indirect, Shift A, color, mix, change the blending mode to add, diffuse direct plus diffuse indirect, and then we need to multiply it by the diffuse color. So another mix node, this time with the multiply blending mode, and we take this and multiply by this. Let's collapse them, duplicate, because we will use exactly the same setup for the glossy. So glossy direct plus glossy indirect times glossy color. Let's duplicate them once again. Transmission direct plus transmission indirect and times transmission color. Now we have to add all of those 3 together, plus emission and plus environment. In case of this animation, I didn't activate the environment pass, but it doesn't matter much because the way environment pass works here is completely different from the way it works in internal render engine. Environment pass is not the influence of environment lighting, but it's in fact the environment itself, the sky itself. If we have the sky visible in our scene and we want to have it included into the render, we have to add environment pass. In our case, it's not necessary. So we only add those three plus emission. So let's duplicate one of the mix nodes with the add blending mode, connect this one plus this one. Let's duplicate it again, take this one plus this one, and now let's add emission to it. And the result of such mix should be exactly the same as the combined pass. In order to show it to you, I would have to render this render layer. And I have to do it every time I open Blender. That's why I don't like working with input render layers. In my work, I use a little bit different approach. I separate the render from compositing. So the way that I am working is to render all of my animation to the sequence of OpenEXR multi-layer file format. This file can store all of the render passes in one file. So here I have the sequence of such files, and I can take the first file of the sequence directly from the file browser and simply drag and drop it here onto the compositor window. It's not always refreshing correctly, but we can very easily simply open this layer section, choose one of the render layers, and as you can see, I have the access to all of the passes. Now when I activate the backdrop, I can connect it to the viewer, Ctrl-Shift-Click, and here's my rendered combined pass, and I can go through all of the render passes by Ctrl-Shift-Clicking this node. So as you can see, I have the combined pass, ambient occlusion, depth, diffuse color, diffuse direct, indirect, emission, which in this case is empty, glossy color, glossy direct, indirect. I have also activated the material index and object index. Here I have the normal pass, maybe I will use it. Shadow pass. This one is not used to recreate the combined pass, but if we have the access to it, we can use it for many purposes. And here we have the transmission color, transmission direct. In most cases, transmission direct pass is empty, and all of the transparency is stored in transmission indirect. This is a very interesting pass, UV pass, and I will show you how we can take advantage of this pass later on. And the vector that we can use for fake motion blur. Okay, by default this image has been imported as the single image, but we know that it's not a single image but image sequence. So let's change it to image sequence. In my animation I am using 25 frames per second as the frame rate. My camera is moving from frame 1 to frame 50. My final animation is 75 frames, but last 25 frames are static, so I didn't have to render those frames. I can use the last frame of the 50 that I have rendered. So the length of this image sequence is 50 frames. Let's use the auto refresh function here. So now I can easily go to the first frame of my animation, and by clicking the right arrow I can go frame by frame, or shift up arrow to go 10 frames forwards, and as you can see it updates very quickly. When I go to frame 50, this is the last frame of this animation. I want to repeat this till the end, so all the way to frame 75, and it will happen so because we didn't activate this option cyclic. So frame 50 is exactly the same as frame 60, and all of the other frames till the last frame of my animation. Okay, so now let's see if this setup works. So we have to reconnect all of those connections from the render layer to this image. So let's cut those connections, Control and drag. I will select all of those nodes, move them here, and reconnect them. So here we have diffuse direct plus diffuse indirect times diffuse color, glossy direct plus glossy indirect times glossy color, transmission direct plus transmission indirect times transmission color. Here I am adding this to this, and then here I am adding this, and in this node I have to add emission to it. So right now we are looking at the combined pass. Let's take a look at this mix, and as you can see, they are exactly the same. We can prove it by adding the color mix node. As the blending mode, I will use the difference, and I will connect this one and this one, and if the result of this node is completely black, it will mean that there is no difference between those two images. And as you can see, it is exactly so. Here, when we are using the backdrop, we cannot see the values of the colors. But if we instead use the UV image editor, we can look at the values of the colors. So let's change this one to the viewer node, and let's deactivate the backdrop here. If we hover the mouse over the image and hit home button, we will see the whole image. Let's zoom in a little, and if we left click, here at the bottom we see the values of the colors, and you can see that all of the channels have the values of 0, so all over the picture we have the pure black color, which means that this image is exactly the same as this image. Okay, let's delete this node, Ctrl-Shift-click this one, and now we can see our composite. Okay, so now we have the access to all of the components and we can change them individually without affecting the others. But before we start, let's make some order here. Maybe let's select those 3 nodes, hit R to rotate them, let's move them somewhere here, SX0. So I would like to have the main chain of the nodes going like this, and have the individual elements that will be connected to this chain going like this. Okay, so this is where the combined diffuse is added to the combined glossy. Let's move those two somewhere over here. I can shift left drag here to add the reroute node and grab it here. Those are very handy nodes, but in this case I would rather use something else. Let's add the layout switch, hit H to collapse it, and instead of using the reroute, I will use the switch. Let's hit G and connect it here. Select this reroute and Ctrl X to delete it, leaving the connection. This switch node does absolutely nothing, but I can very easily label it, and in this case it's my combined diffuse, so I can call it diffuse, and this way it's easier for me to see what I'm doing. Now, in this node I am adding glossy to it, so I will type in plus glossy. Let's expand them. Here I am adding transmission, plus transmission, and here plus emit. Okay, let's select those 3 and move them a little bit down and make some order here. So this is times diffuse color, so let's type in times diffuse color. Let's expand this one, move it here, and this is plus diffuse indirect. Let's duplicate this switch, connect it here, move it here, and this is our diffuse direct. Okay, let's go a little bit further with this. Let's duplicate this one. Once again, this is indirect, color, indirect, color. Okay, so in terms of functionality, I didn't change anything, but I have my space a little bit better organized. Now when I want to change the diffuse direct pass, I simply plug some effects here. If I want to change, for example, the glossy color, I plug some nodes here. Let's take a look at our image. And let me show you the first use of the passes. Right now, I won't be changing any of the textures, but I will try to reduce the amount of noise that we have here. In case of this image, the noise is not that much visible, but anyway, let's try to do something about it. There is a popular technique of reducing the amount of noise by using bilateral blur. It is described in user's manual, so let's again go to Blender Wiki, and here we have compositing with nodes, composite node types, and we have a filter nodes, and down here we can find the section devoted to bilateral blur node. When we go a little bit lower, we can see a very interesting example of reducing the noise that can be present, for example, in ambient occlusion pass. So we have our image and we plug it to the image socket of bilateral blur, and as the determinator, we can use the sum of the normal pass and Z pass. And here in this example, some low factor of this sum is used. Okay, so let's try to use this technique on our image. First, I will try to do it on the whole image, on my composite. So let's take the mix node with the add blending mode, and let's also use some low factor like 0.3, let's say. Let's shift click this socket, and I will plug the normal pass to it. So let's go here, shift click the normal output socket and hit F to make the connection. And I would like to add the Z pass to it. So deselect all of the nodes, shift click the depth output socket, let's go here, shift click this input, F, and let's take a look at what we have. Let's make this factor a little bit higher. I'm trying to remove those black areas. Okay, so I will use this as the determinator. Let's now add filter bilateral blur, take our image, plug it here, and take this, plug it here, and let's see what we have. So as you can see, it's a complete disaster. The noise is removed, but we destroyed our image. So as you can see, it's not the best idea to work on the whole combined image when using this technique to reduce the noise amount. But we can take a look at individual passes and see what really causes the noise. So let's see, let's take a look at the diffuse direct. And as we can see, it's in fact noise free. Diffuse indirect, here we have some noise. Diffuse color is clean, glossy direct as well. Glossy indirect, we have some noise here. Glossy color clear, transmission indirect, this in fact is noise free. So as we can see, we have some noise in two passes, in diffuse indirect and in glossy indirect. So maybe it would be better to simply denoise only those passes and mix them back into the final image. Let's try to do it and see what happens. So first I will move those nodes a little bit away from here and maybe take all of those ones and move them a little bit to the right to make some space here. So I will be working on diffuse indirect pass, so I would need some space here. So let me select all of those nodes, move them a little bit down, and now let me take those two, move them here. So here I have this sum of normal and Z pass, and I am using it as the determinator. And here I will plug the diffuse indirect. Let's take a look at it. So this is before and this is after. So now we can, instead of plugging the diffuse indirect directly here, we can use this one. Okay, so now just for the organizational purpose, let me move those two nodes a little bit away. Let's grab this one, move it here, and let's take one of the switches, duplicate it, plug it here. Let's call it determinator. Now let's take care about the glossy indirect. So I will again take all of those nodes, move them a little bit down. Now I will take those two, Control-Shift-D. This way I have duplicated them together with the connections. Let's move them a little bit down. And now here I will take the glossy indirect. Take a look at the difference. This is before, this is after, and I can plug this result here. And let's take a look at our final image. Now let's take a look at the difference. So I will select both of those bilateral blur nodes, hit M to mute them. So here we see some noise. Let's hit M again to unmute them. And as you can see, we got rid of all of the noise. Okay, we still have some issues that we can take care about, but let me switch to the UV image editor. Let's zoom in here. And as you can see, we have some fireflies. First, we can try to remove them using the easy way. And I will also use just one of the passes. Those ones are present on the transparent areas, so let's take a look at the transmission indirect. And that's right, they are present here. So let me work only on this pass. I will simply try to use the filter de-speckle, and let's try to plug it here and take a look at how it looks like with the default settings. So it seems that that's all we have to do. Let's collapse it, H, and take a look at the result. Okay, so that's how it looks like. Now let's focus on flexibility. So we will be changing the textures of this box without re-rendering anything. So I will pretend that I am doing the version for the other market. Here I have the Polish version of this package, and let's say that the client gave me also the texture for the English version, and the only difference between those textures is that those descriptions here are written in English. But before I do it, let me concentrate on this glass. Let's imagine that before I started working on this project, I asked the client if there shouldn't be any label here on this glass element. And I got the answer that no. It looks exactly like this and there is no label here. But basing on my experience, I don't trust the client 100%. I wanted to be prepared on a scenario that in the last moment the client comes and says, well, in fact, there is some label here. Okay, so first let's imagine that we trust the client. And let's take a look at the shader of this glass. I used the very common technique of using the glass shader that is mixed with a transparent shader, and as the factor, the is shadow ray output of the light path node is used. This way I don't have to use caustics, so I am cheating a bit, but the result that we get is really believable. Okay, so let's take a look at what happens if I render all of this using this shader as the glass. I have rendered just this area of the image. Let's take a look at it. This is how the combined pass looks like and it's okay. But let's take a look at other passes. Here we have the transmission color. I have used the white color, so it's no surprise that here we have the white color. Transmission direct is empty. Transmission indirect looks like this. And this is in fact the result that I want to get. However, if I wanted in post-production to add some label here, I would probably need some information about the diffuse or maybe glossy here. In fact, glossy is present here. Let's take a look at the glossy direct. Well, this is empty, but glossy indirect. So this is maybe not the complete information about the reflections, but I think that it's enough. But let's take a look at the diffuse passes. Here's the diffuse color, and it's pure black. Diffuse direct, well, it's also black. Diffuse indirect, and it's also black here. So we don't have enough information in those passes to insert some label here. I would want to have some information about the diffuse. So the only way to do it is to include some diffuse part into the shader. So I have modified this shader a little bit. So as you can see here, I have added the diffuse shader. And I used the mixture of those two, this one and those ones. But as the factor, I used some value very close to 1. It cannot be 1 because if I used 1, this glass would replace the diffuse completely. But I used the factor of 0.95. This way, this shader is almost invisible, but my passes will store enough information that I can later on use in compositing. So here's the render that I get when I used this shader. And now let's take a look at the passes. So here's the transmission indirect, and it's almost exactly the same as the clean glass. Transmission color is a little bit different, but what's the most important is that diffuse direct is not empty, and diffuse indirect is not empty. There is one important thing here. All of my meshes that I used here are UV unwrapped. So as you can see here, this mesh, although initially I didn't want to use any texture on it, is UV unwrapped, and I have activated the UV pass here. So now I will make use of it in compositing. So here's the label that the client gave me to place on this glass element, and I treated this exactly the same as I would if I wanted to use it as a texture. So I have exported the UV layout, and then in Photoshop I have placed this logo over here. I've removed the UV layout, and that's the image that I exported from Photoshop. So let's now drag it onto the compositor, and this is how it looks like. This is the alpha channel of this image, and this is how it would look when we composite it over the transparency grid. Okay, so now to position it correctly here on this glass, we will use the UV pass. Let me split this window and here get rid of this properties panel. And here I will zoom into my rendered animation. Let's also take this image and move it here. So now we have the easy access to all of our sources, and here we can play with them. Okay, so let's zoom in here, take one of the switches, duplicate it, and let's call it label. Now it's selected, let's shift select this image, hit F, and this way here we are looking at our image. Okay, let's duplicate it again, and here I will connect my UV pass. So let's call this switch UV. And now let's shift click the UV output of this image, F, and here we have our UV pass. So now we can use the distort map UV, connect our image here, UV here, and let's take a look at it. And as you can see, it now fits exactly as it should. But as you can see, the alpha channel of this label has been ignored. In the map UV node, we have the slider alpha, so it may seem that if we set its value to 1, maybe the alpha channel of this input image would be taken into account, but as you can see, it doesn't behave this way. So we have to pass the alpha channel of this image through the map UV node individually. So let's take this node, Ctrl-Shift-D to duplicate it, keeping the connections. But in this case, I would like to extract the alpha channel first. So let's use the converter separate RGBA, and let's plug it here. And take the alpha channel and plug it here. So now when we take a look at the output of this node, we see that we have the proper alpha channel. But I don't want this texture to appear here or on any other elements, so I should also limit its influence to this glass area. I have rendered the material index of this glass shader, so now I can use it. Let's add converter ID mask, and let's plug the material index to it, F. Let's take a look at it. And for the glass material, I have used the index of 1. But I will also activate the anti-aliasing. Okay, let's move this node a little bit here. Here I have the alpha channel of the label that is UV mapped. So in order to combine the two, I will simply multiply them. So let's use converter math node, change the operation to multiply, and take this, multiply by this. So we have this. And here, as you can see, we have some issues at the edges of this material, but we can take the result of this ID mask and pass it through filter delayed erode node. Let's plug it here. Let's take a look at it. We can set some negative distance, and this should solve the problem. Okay, so here we have the colors of the label, here we have the alpha. Let's organize the space a little bit better. Let's move those two a little bit down. Take this one here, those ones here, and here let's add another switch. And this will be the index material. And now let's mix it into our composite. So let's take the last mix node, let's duplicate it, and this one will be our label. Change the blending mode to mix, and now I will connect the output of our composite so far to the first input of this node, And to the second one, I will connect the colors of our label. So here's how the connections of this node look like. And now as the factor, I will use this. Let's collapse this node, move it a little bit here, connect it to the viewer to see what we got. So everything is fine and dandy, but in terms of shading, this is just a flat color. So now we will make use of the diffuse component of this glass shader. I will take the diffuse direct plus diffuse indirect, and I will multiply it by this, so I will treat this as the diffuse color. Okay, so let's here add a color mix node, add blending mode, take diffuse direct plus diffuse indirect, so it looks like this. Let's duplicate this node, change the blending mode to multiply, and I will multiply this by this. So let's select both of those nodes F, take a look at it. Now let's take a look at our final composite, and let's connect this result to the second input of this node. So as you can see, it got a little bit of shading. I would also like to add a little bit glossiness to this material. In fact, I would like it to behave similarly to the material of this box. So let's take a look at the material of this box. Here I have used the mix of diffuse shader and the glossy shader. As the factor I used 0.4, which means that 60% of this shader will be taken and 40% of this one. Now, because we are in the shaders, let me draw your attention to one very important thing here. Here I have the image texture, and it looks like this. This is how the mesh is unwrapped on it, but it doesn't matter much at this point. What is important here is that exactly the same texture, exactly the same colors are used for both of those shaders. Sometimes we would want to change this texture a little bit to have the different variations of them to be used in one shader and the other shader. Or here for the glossy, we would, instead of using any texture, we would like to use just the color. But when we are using the technique of combining the image from the passes, I wouldn't recommend doing so. And I would also not recommend to use the clamp value here different than 0. Let me show you what may happen if we don't follow those rules. This is the example of diffuse direct pass, and here in this test I have used some clamp value. Diffuse direct pass shouldn't have any influence of the color of the texture in it. But as you can see here, we have this influence. So then, if we want to replace the texture in compositing, this situation may cause us some issues. Okay, but let's go back to our label. We would like it to behave similarly to this box. And here we are looking at the shader of this box. And here on the label we have used only the diffuse component. As you can see in this shader, we have used the mixture of diffuse and glossy shader. The factor is set to 0.4, which means that we should use only 60% of the diffuse component. And the remaining 40% should be our glossy shader. So let's go back to the compositing nodes, and here's our label. Let's organize the space here a little bit better. So I will take one of the switches, I will plug it here, and this is our diffuse indirect. Let's duplicate it, plug it here, move it here, and this is our diffuse direct. Label, this is in fact the color, so let's call it label color. So maybe let's organize this space the same way as we did here. So here we have plus diffuse indirect. Let's collapse it. Let's duplicate this one, plug it here, move it here. Let's collapse this one, move it here. And this is times diffuse color. So maybe we should take those three and move them down. Let's here add some reroute maybe and move it here. And let's align those ones with those ones. Let me change the snapping to the node X and Y. And let's grab those SX0, GX, and let's align them I'm holding Control, let's align them with those nodes. Let's select those ones, SX0, GX, Control, and let's align them like this. So this is our label, and here's the diffuse component of it. Well, in fact, we should move them a little bit to the left. And because we should use just the 60% of it, let me simply multiply the color value by 0.6. So I will add another mix node with a multiply blending mode, plug it here, and as the second color, I will use the gray color with a value of 0.6. Now, as you can see, it went darker. Let's collapse this node. And let's create the glossy component of this label. So let's maybe take one of the switches, duplicate it, move it down, rename it to glossy direct, connect it to glossy direct. Let's duplicate it, move it down. This will be glossy indirect. Let's connect it to glossy indirect. And as the glossy color, I will also use this texture that is passed through map UV node. Let's select this mix node, Ctrl-Shift-D, H to unhide it. And for this one, I will use 0.4 H, and I will use this one as the glossy color. So let's now add glossy direct plus glossy indirect, H. Let's duplicate this one, connect it here, move it here. And this will be glossy indirect. Let's copy this label and paste it here. Let's now duplicate this one, move it here, connect it like this. Change the blending mode to multiply. This will be glossy color. And I will take this and plug it to the second input of this node. Let's take a look at it. So now, here we have the diffuse component of the label, and here we have the glossy component of the label. And we have to add one to the other. So another mix node with the add blending mode. Take this and add it to this. Let's take a look at it. Let's collapse this node. Label, and let's now connect it to the second input of this node. Let's take this, move it here, take a look at it, and now the behavior of this label is very similar to the behavior of this box. Okay, so in case of this label, using the UV pass worked perfectly, but it doesn't have to be this way. Let me show you what I mean. I told you before that I would like to change the texture of this box. So if we wanted to use the same technique as we used here, we would simply take this other texture and pass it through the map UV node. But unfortunately, this is how it looks like. We have the issues here at the edges. Let's see what happens if we change this alpha value to 0. At first it seems that it behaves a little bit better, but anyway, those edges is a disaster. We could try to play with this value to try to fix this, but it doesn't solve the problem. In this case, we could use the alpha of 100, and because in fact in those areas the original texture and this texture are exactly the same, this should mix in nicely. But what if we had some big differences in those textures? And let's also take a look at this top part. What happened with the texture in this area is unacceptable. So in some cases we cannot avoid re-rendering something. But it doesn't mean that we have to re-render everything. We could instead use the internal render engine, set the material of this box like this. Let's disable the nodes, make it shadeless, add a texture to it, use the image texture, link this texture, change coordinates to UV, remove all of the other objects from the scene, or simply leave the layer where this object is active, deactivating the other ones. In this case, we can use the PNG file format. set the output correctly, disable compositing in post-processing. In performance, we can substantially increase the tile size. Let's render this. Oh, in the shading options, we should change the alpha mode to straight. Let's re-render this. And as you can see, it takes like a fraction of the second. So we can render all of the animation using this shader. It won't take long. And then use this as the color input for the diffuse and for the glossy, using the proper factors, and it should work perfectly. Okay, so I have rendered this. It took like a half a minute. That's how it looks like. And I will use it as the color input of the diffuse and of the glossy. So here's my diffuse color. Let me duplicate this switch and call it box English color, and let's connect it to the sequence. Take a look at it. We see that it's different, but it's just because we have to multiply it by 0.6. Color mix multiply, second color, gray color with a value of 0.6. That's the original color, that's the new color, so it works perfectly. Now we have to mix it into the whole diffuse color pass. So let's duplicate this one, change the blending mode to mix, plug it here, connect this one here, take a look at it. Let's also use the alpha of the second input. And it's okay, but not 100%. Let's take a look here. Well, I didn't render this correctly, but it can easily be fixed here in compositing because I have rendered the objects and material indices. So let me duplicate this switch, call it index OB. Let's connect it to the index OB. Take a look at it, pass it through converter ID mask, plug it here, index of 1, index of 2. So that's the one that we should use. Let's use anti-aliasing, and we can use this as the factor of this mix node. Let's take a look at it right now, and everything is fine. Let's collapse this node, move it a little bit here, and now we have to reconnect this input. Let's maybe split this window, change this one to node editor, get rid of the properties panel, change it to compositing nodes, home button, let's go here. I have zoomed in to the last node of the chain, so now it's easy for me to see the whole result. Let me Control-Shift click this node, and now here we have the problems, but it's only because we didn't take care about the glossy color. So let's maybe select all of those nodes, Control-Shift-D, and move them down here, cut this connection. Here, as you can see, we have the glossy color, so let's reconnect this here, Control-F, and take a look at it. But for the glossy, we shouldn't use the factor of 0.6, but 0.4 H. Now we can select this one, go here, select this socket, Shift left click, Control F, take a look at the final result, and we have easily created the English version of the texture. Let's take a look at the difference between the original one and the new one. We can simply select those mix nodes, mute them, so that's the original, unmute them, and here's the new texture. The behavior of it is exactly the same as the original one, so we have achieved exactly what we wanted. Okay, so now we need just a few final touches, so I will add the claim that I received from the client, and it looks like this. And I would also like to darken the corners a little bit, something like this and this. So this area should be a little bit darker, and this one. So I will add the elliptical vignette, something like this. So let's add the matte ellipse mask. In order to see what I am doing with this ellipse mask, I have to activate the backdrop. Let's maximize this window. So here I can see the bounding box of this mask. Let's plug the final image to the first socket of it. Let's extend the width, the height. Let's rotate this. Let's make it a lot wider, a little bit higher. Now let's make everything that is outside of the mask black. So I will simply mix add color mix, I will mix the final image with the black color. Now I can blur this mask, so let's add filter blur, fast Gaussian. Let's connect it like this, take a look at it, and let's blur it. Maybe a little bit more, or even more. And now we can multiply this, our final image, by this, by our mask. So let's move those nodes a little bit down, add a color mix node, multiply blending mode, take the image, multiply it by this, take a look at it. Now we can change this color to something else. Let's make it a little bit brighter, and maybe something like this. Let's reorganize this a little bit. This is vignette. And now let's add our claim. So I will take this mix node, duplicate it, connect it here. This will be the claim. Change the blending mode to mix. Let's move it here. And now here we have to add this claim. So let's add another input image. Select the claim. Take a look at it. Okay, let's duplicate one of the switches. Move it here. This will be our claim. Claim. Let's connect the two. Let's duplicate it. Connect it. Move it here. And here I will choose the color of the claim. And this one I will use as the factor. Let's take a look at it. So now it's pure white, but we can change this color to whatever we want. This, or this, but in this case, I will leave it pure white. Now I would like to animate the opacity of it. So here, between the two, let's add converter math node, plug it here, change the operation to multiply, and let's animate this value. Let's set it to 0. My animation is 75 frames, and I would like the claim to begin appearing at, let's say, frame 35. So let's go to frame 35. Let's insert a keyframe for the value and go like 15 frames forwards to frame 50, change the value to 1 and insert a keyframe. So at frame 35 we have the value of 0, and when we go further frame by frame, it's beginning to fade in, and at frame 50 it has a full opacity and it stays this way till the end of the animation. Okay, if we wanted to, we could make some final color correction, maybe add some effects to it, and then the only thing left to do is to render this composite. This is how the final setup of the nodes looks like. I kept everything organized from the beginning to the end, so now even if I open this file like a month or 2 months from now, it will be easy for me to see what's going on here. I have used the switches that have labels. Most of the nodes are named. Here I have the main chain of the nodes. All of the sources are grouped here. So now let's render this. The last node of the setup is connected to the viewer, but it also needs to be connected to the output composite node. To render this, we don't need our scene at all. And it also doesn't matter which render engine we use. And to render the composite, it's best to use the separate file or at least separate scene. So in order not to lose this nodes setup, let me add the new scene, and I will use the option link objects. Let's call this scene comp. Let's select all of the objects and delete them. Let's change the render engine to Blender's internal. And we in fact don't need anything from the scene. Let's disable anything that can slow down the render. So let's remove the world. Here we have several render passes activated. Let's maybe add another render layer, call it comp, and delete this one. Here, let's disable all of those options. We don't need them. We don't even need anti-aliasing. Let's use a PNG as an output file format. We don't need 4 channels, we only need RGB. Let's set the output. In post-processing, let's activate the compositing. Let's go to the first frame of the animation, hit F12. So I'm just checking if everything works. Let's go to the last frame, F12. If we checked that everything works, we can hit Ctrl F12. Now let's wait till it completes. Okay, it's completed, so let's view it. Let's change this window to Movie Clip Editor. Open. Let's select the first frame of our animation. N-T to get rid of those panels. Let's maximize this window. Alt-A. And you probably noticed that we have some problems here or here. And this is in fact caused by the fireflies that appeared in diffuse indirect and glossy indirect passes, and we have used bilateral blur to denoise those passes, so those fireflies went completely crazy. So let's fix it quickly and render it again. So here's where the problem begins. Let's take a look at the diffuse indirect pass. I remember that we have the problem in the frame 44. Let's go to frame 44. Let's take a look at the output of the bilateral blur, and here's the guilty one. Let's left click it, so I am now checking the color values of this point. Let's take a look at diffuse indirect alone. Let's zoom in here, and here we have the points that have some reasonable values, but this one, as you can see, have the values like 700 something, 300 something, 400 something, so it's completely crazy. And when we blur the point that has so huge color values, this is what happens. So we have to take care about it before it goes to the bilateral blur node. So I will now change the values of those crazy pixels to something reasonable. So here's what I will do. Let's add a converter math node, change the operation to the greater than. Let's connect our diffuse indirect pass to the first socket. And let's set the second value to something like, I don't know, maybe 4. Let's take a look at it. And now every pixel that's value is less than 4 becomes black, and all of the pixels that have the value greater than 4 become white. And I would like to replace those pixels by its neighbor. So how do I do it? Let me add the distort translate node. Let's connect this pass here. And let's move the whole picture 1 pixel to the right. So that's how the original looks like, and that's the translated one. So as you can see, everything moved 1 pixel to the right. Before, after. And I will now mix this with this, using this as the factor. So let's add a mix node, plug it here. Let's plug the translated one to the second input of this node. Use this one as the factor. Let's take a look at it. So this is before and this is after. Let's collapse those nodes. Let's take a look at the result of bilateral blur. And all of the problems seem to have disappeared. We would also need to do exactly the same with the glossy indirect. So let's simply select those 3 nodes, duplicate them, move them down. Let's zoom in here, reconnect everything. But here for this glossy indirect, let's maybe increase this value. Let's set it to 10. Let's once again check the previous result. So we had an issue at frame 14. Let's check the frame 14. it's okay. 22, 22, it's okay. 23, here we have the problem, but here it disappeared. So it seems that everything should be fine. So now let's re-render this and see what happens. Control F12. Okay, so we have solved all of the problems and created the setup that allows us to make versions and do a lot more adjustments than when we didn't use the buses. That's all from me, Bartek Skorupa. Thanks for your attention and see you next time.